Hey everybody, welcome. Thank you so much for joining. My name is Matthew. Today I'm going to talk about the Austrian theory of the business cycle. So, I've finally reached a point in my video series here where I'm just going to show interest rates. It took a long time, 50 plus videos to finally get here. And I hope it's clear why I haven't just focused on yields or rates or what the Federal Reserve or a central bank does or doesn't do. Because there are a lot of other things that happen in the economy, and more important than rates surely is supply. That's why I've focused a lot on the money supply, the central bank balance sheet, also broader money supplies. Nonetheless, I'm going to be wrapping up the series here soon on the Federal Reserve's weekly balance sheet, and I figured for this one, let's just take the balance sheet away entirely. Should be clear by now that the way that they influence interest rates, such as here, now this light green shaded area, what is it? This is the Fed funds target. This is the target of the short-term interest rate that banks lend to each other in the United States. It's an uncollateralized short-term loan. When one bank is short on these, quote, precious bank reserves, another bank, they will lend those reserves to each other, and that is the market for federal funds. It's very similar to LIBOR in Europe. What is supposed to be the most secure, most liquid, most safe money in the world, really, is the market for federal funds. This is the rate at which banks lend their reserves, which is part of base money, which the Federal Reserve controls solely. They lend their reserves to each other. The story with the central bank let's say this has changed throughout the centuries, but certainly in the recent decades, is that the central bank only influences short-term interest rates. I think there are plenty of arguments to be made that they plenty influence long-term rates as well. That's a topic for another video. Nonetheless, I'm going to show you a range of interest rates here now, not just policy rates, but market rates. That is the rate for United States Treasury bills, notes, and bonds. That is very short-term, mid-term, and long-term debt. Now, to be sure, this isn't the only debt market in the world. The United States government has a lot of debt. The Federal Reserve owns a lot of that debt directly, which I've talked about before. But there is corporate debt, personal debt, household debt, credit card debt. There's a lot of different debt markets in the world. This isn't a commentary on how much there is or whatnot, but clearly one of the most liquid debt markets in the world is the market for United States securities. So that's why I'm going to layer these on top of the yields on top of this. Remember, yield is inverse of price, so I always quote bonds in terms of yield, not in terms of a price or face value or a coupon rate. You look at the yield, which is the net overall compound annual growth that you will earn from the moment you buy that bond until maturity, until the duration expires of that bond. Short-term notes will have one yield, long-term notes will have a different yield. It's always quoted on an annualized compound growth yield to maturity basis. That's how we price bonds. Nonetheless, we see here that from the early 80s, the Fed began explicitly targeting the market for federal funds. They were doing it before with something called the discount rate, which we talked about before. I'm not going to show that on this slide, but I will show you now. I'll layer in the effective Fed funds rate. This is the actual weighted average market rate that banks lend their reserves to each other. I'm going to do it right now. Here we go. Here we go. The effective Fed funds rate for the past 70 years or so. Again, the discount rate, which is a different rate that the Fed charges banks, that's directly an emergency from the Fed. That was more important here in the 50s and the 60s. And then they started to target the Fed funds market directly. The discount rate became much, much less important in recent decades. And we have here the discount rate is the green shaded area, again, which they are targeting. So let's just zoom in really quickly. Again, sometimes the In times of market turmoil, the Fed funds can shoot up way above the target rate, or sometimes it's below, but generally it straddles the Fed funds target rate. Also, we talked a lot about this. We're going to talk about this more in the future. Not so much this video, because I want to try to keep the content manageable. A lot happened here. Interest was charged on reserves, so I'm going to put that on just so you see it. It's not really going to be so crucial for this video, but interest was not necessarily charged, but it was offered to banks by the Federal Reserve if they didn't want to lend out any of their reserves to the market. And that is here. Okay, so we see that we talked about this yesterday with the corridor system, quickly became a floor system. Basically, just here, it didn't match the Fed funds target, which eventually turned into the upper bound. So many different rates. They try to be so scientific about this. But basically, from this point in 2008, you now have this interest on reserves. And it doesn't matter if they're excess reserves or not excess reserves. This interest on reserves has been granted, has been offered to banks for a long time here when we were in zero interest rate policy environment at 0.25%. Okay, so they've started to do a lot more in recent years as far as different policy rates, changing it. And you can also see that historically, I've made this point many times, from around World War II, discount rate, the policy rate was at 0.5%. Here you see, I know I'm starting 10 years after World War II ended here. It can be very close to zero again. Very, very low rates here at this time. But this is not the policy rate exactly. This is still kind of a market rate the banks charge each other to lend reserves. So it was very, very low here, 0% after World War II. Went up. Paul Volcker had to prick the inflation bubble, the gold bubble, in the early 1980s. Went up the Fed funds rate to 22%. 22%, I think, was the top on the week. 22.36%, there we go. 22.36%. And then down again, as we see here, to a 0% environment. These are three extremes, okay, from after World War II to the 1980s to now again. Three different extremes of interest rates throughout the millennia. You'd have to go back to ancient Greece, ancient Sumer, beyond that to find 20% interest rates. Never have we had sustainable, systemic interest rates at 0%, never. And we had them twice in the last century. So again, this video is going to be about the Austrian theory of the business cycle and how the central bank impacts the Austrian theory of the business cycle. I'm going to get there, but now, I've mentioned, we're going to overlay yield to maturities of market rates, which again, it's government debt, but this is a very liquid market. And I have these rates from the early 70s. And so we're going to start to go from the short term to the long term in terms of duration. And we're going to see how these different yields, which effectively means the value of a bond, changes. United States government debt. Okay, so let's start with the 1-year treasury. It means whatever percent you see, this is exactly an annualized rate that you're going to get at the end of a year for holding this bond. Whenever you buy it, doesn't matter, at any point on the graph. I'm going to show you the 1-year treasury maturity right now. Okay, it's in the dark blue. Very close to the Fed funds rate, you see, very close. A little bit above it at times, sometimes below it, okay? Below it here, even 1 year was below this Fed funds, which is often an overnight rate. So that tells you something we'll get to, okay? And whatever you see here is a percentage. You see here, January 1977, January 5th, 4.96%. Very simple, this is a 1-year treasury. Let's look at a little bit longer duration, 2-year treasury, okay? It's gonna be a little bit of a lighter blue, 2-year. This starts a little bit later, 1977 or so. And you can see generally, not always, but generally, the 2-year is a little bit above the 1-year. So you're rewarded with a little bit more interest, a little bit more income if you hold and invest in the United States government for not just 1 year, but you commit to 2 years. But again, this is still an annualized rate. It doesn't mean for the 2-year bond, you get 6.99% over the entire 2 years. No, you'll get the effective compound growth of 6.99% 1 year and then 6.99% for the second year. So that's very important with interest rates. Again, always with growth rates, with interest rates, if you want to make any sense out of them at all, they should be an annualized figure. Okay, so that's the 2-year. Now let's go to the 3-year. Okay, a little bit lighter blue. Hard to kind of even see the difference here sometimes, but it's generally higher, a little bit higher. Here we see October 22nd, 1997, the 3 years, 5.97%, 2-year, 5.91%, 1 year, 5.58%. Notice that the Fed funds is not below all of those, though. At this time, at this particular week, Fed funds is 5.76%. Now let's go to 5-year. A little bit lighter blue still. 5-year. Let's go to 10. Okay. This now we start to call these the notes, 5-year notes and the 10-year notes. Typically the 1-year debt, 1 year and less, is called a bill. 2 to 10 is called a note. Okay, so a little bit lighter blue here, a little bit higher as far as yield because you're holding longer duration risk. Let's go to the 20-year. These start to be called bonds now in the United States. Germany has boons, the UK has gilts. They have different names per country, but we call these bonds in the United States, the longest term maturities. It's a 20-year, and now the very lightest shade of blue here is going to be the 30-year bond. I'm going to put that on right now. There we go. Might be kind of hard to see there, even in the tooltip, but it's the last number in black on the tooltip, the 30-year bond. So, if we look at this now in totality, we can see the price in terms of yield that the United States government has had to pay on its debt securities, on its debt over the long term. Okay, again, historical lows, historical highs to, again, historical lows for short term and pretty low for long term. Okay, so let's just pick a point here in 2013. You see that all the way out to the 3-year, we are under 1%. Okay, so the 3-year is 0.64%, 5-year, we go above 1%. Whereas if you go back to the 90s, that's kind of unheard of. You're at 4, 5, 6%. 80s, of course, much higher. All the way back to the 60s, you'd have to go the other way to see long-term yields even get close to 3%, 3 to 4%. Now, Austrian theory of the business cycle. Basically, what the Austrian theory says, and Friedrich Hayek won the Nobel Prize for this. It took him about 40 years to be recognized for it. He did this work, really all of it, in the 20s and the 30s, influenced by Ludwig von Mises and many other Austrians. They talked about this a lot. They don't tell you what the natural rate of interest is. Of course, we can't know what the natural rate of interest is, but we can say how the business cycle will work, seeing how cash balances go in and out of banks and how rates are affected that way. Okay, so when rates are low, let's not talk about duration, but just generally, when rates are low, what does that mean? That means that probably the stock of cash is high in banks. Okay, and why would the stock of cash be high in banks? Because people aren't spending. The economy might be a little bit shaky. People are uncertain. Maybe some people are losing jobs. Who knows? The economy is a little bit uncertain. So cash in banks is high. And since the cash of loanable funds is high, there's going to be competition to bid up credit. And so rates are going to be low. Rates are going to be low. So what does a low interest rate signal to the entrepreneur? A low interest rate signals that the entrepreneur can invest for the long term. And this matches perfectly with what I just said, is that people are a little bit scared. There may be a little bit shakiness in the economy. People aren't spending as much money. Cash is in banks. Stock of cash is high in the financial system, and the interest rate is low. It gels perfectly. And so what that means is entrepreneurs can invest. They can take that low interest rate as a signal that the market would prefer to not do so much consumption now in the short term, but invest for the long term. So they can retool some factories, they can do construction projects, they can invest for the longer term. That's what that signal is. Now, as those projects come to market, they come to fruition, Presumably, if the project is good, people will start to interact with that, whether it's on the supplier side or the consumer side. There's going to be more spending involved once projects come to fruition. And once that happens, what's going to happen? Well, cash balances will then fall in banks. There's going to be more spending. Cash balances fall. And what happens to the interest rate at that point? Interest rate will rise. Remember, the interest rate is not the price of money. Okay, that's the exchange rate. The interest rate is the price of credit. But as the balance of loanable funds changes in banks, that will of course affect the interest rate. And the Austrian Theory, as Hayek has pioneered and Mises, tells us that this is a signal now for entrepreneurs to cool off. To cool off is the natural business cycle where interest rates are high, so it might not be such a good idea to borrow at such a high rate of interest for the future. People are pretty comfortable in the present, so you might just want to cool off at the moment. And then the cycle repeats. Okay, so that's the Austrian theory of the business cycle. I didn't bring in a central bank at all. It's natural. It's natural. That's the idea. They don't say what the interest rate should be, how low is too low, how high is too high. They don't say these things. Okay, but we just talk about the natural rate and loanable funds, supply of money, the business cycle. Now, there is an X factor here. We come back to this chart that we can introduce, okay, to these rates. I showed you there's short-term rates, there's long-term rates. What is the X factor that we can introduce? Well, in fact, I introduced it at the very beginning of the video. It is the central bank. We know for sure. Now, again, they use the discount rate to target rates here, which is a little bit different than the Fed funds rate, which they officially started to target in the early 80s. But again, one of these things is the market. One of these things is a planning board. Okay, the planning board is the central bank. They set this, which I am highlighting, the target rate. How they get there, we've talked about. It's either decreasing reserves or increasing bank reserves on the margins for banks. That's what they do. But the question, of course, is what's the natural rate? What's the natural rate in an economy? Well, we can't know it when a central bank keeps doing this because, look, we can go all the way out to 30 years and we can see that it's pretty close, okay? We'll get to, say, here, here, and here where it's farther. Generally in this chart, we can see that even the 30-year bond, all right, the lightest blue shaded line on this chart, is going to be pretty close to the green shaded area. One is market, one is a planning board. So I think it's safe to say that the Federal Reserve sets interest rates. They will sometimes try to be cheeky and say they don't set interest rates, or at worst case, they set short-term interest rates. But again, you can see very often here that long-term rates are very, very close to short-term rates, which are very, very close to the federal funds, which are very, very close to the federal funds target, the green. So one of these things is a planning board, one of these things is the market. I know that they're government securities, but they're government securities that are purchased in the market. And up until, let's say, 2008, the Federal Reserve actually did not own, as a proportion, so many government securities as it does now. We can see that there is indeed an organization that influences, that interferes with the natural rate of interest and doesn't allow for a natural rate of interest to occur, or doesn't allow for the regular Austrian theory of the business cycle to occur. So what could we conclude from that? Well, as is the theory, and many people have talked about, I'm certainly not the first, even though this is the very first video that I'm doing for you on interest rates, what we can conclude is, since they don't know the natural rate, and they set the rates themselves via policy, we're probably going to get more extreme booms and busts. That's what we can conclude. The theory is that this cheap money, okay, you can see it's just much cheaper than longer term rates. It spurs excess booms. And you can see that precisely when we have these low rates is when we get the booms. And this was really the most famous one as far as Austrians are concerned. You can see just that beautiful fanning out of the yield curve where Alan Greenspan, the maestro, drops interest rates to historical lows, near historical lows. Fed funds target is 1% at this time for many, many years. And he holds it there. Short-term rates fall and fall and fall with it. What does that do? It's a signal to the market to invest invest they do. They invest in real estate and mortgage-backed securities, and we know the rest is history. And then when inflation runs too hot, what do they have to do? Well, they have to cut it off. They have to cut it off. They raise rates, and then, of course, we get a recession. And you see that every time, okay? Raising rates, recession, raising rates, recession. You just see it. Another thing to say here regarding the yield curve, not specifically the Austrian theory of the business cycle, but if you see white space between the different maturities, as you see here, it typically is an expansionary phase. And if you see here, for example, where the yield curve becomes really compressed, or even inverted, which actually happens here. I'm going to take off short-term rates so you can see them. Okay, I'm going to take off the 1 year, 2 year, 3 year, 5 year. Look, the lightest blues were below the 1 year, and they're below the interest paid on reserves. They're below the overnight Fed funds rate, which banks lend to each other. Okay, so these lightest blue shaded areas here. So this is what you call an inverted yield curve. And never in history has an inverted yield curve been present where there's not at least some portion of this time that's a recession. So there's no false positives with that signal. When the yield curve inverts, it's usually a bad sign. When some long-term rates, let's even just look at the 10-year. Here's the 10-year, the 2 year, it's close, doesn't fully invert here. And again, we have to wait sort of for the wise overlords at the NBER in the United States to tell us if there was a recession or not. This is an ex post facto thing. But nonetheless, when you see that these bands tighten, it's always a recession for some point in the period. And when there's white space there, that is showing expansion. That is showing expansion in the economy. So this is kind of how you would marry the Austrian business cycle theory with the actual market rates. One of these things is a planning board, the policy rates. As Friedrich Hayek called it, it was the pretense of knowledge. We think that we know what the price should be of something set by a planning board. The Soviet Union thought they knew this for, lumber and concrete and all the rest. They failed miserably in this planning endeavor, but this is policy that we are using to set the price of credit. One of these things is market. And is it a purely free market? I think you can clearly, obviously argue no. And you can say that for sure, at least the short-term rates, right, let's take out long-term from the 5 even, okay? Let's just look at 3 year and down, 1, 2, and 3, even 5, I guess you can show. Look at how close these rates are typically to the Fed funds effective rate. I don't need to show you spreads. I don't need to get too scientific. You can just see that it's very, very close. The black line in the green shaded area, that is set by a planning board. It's not set by the market. So we really do have theory versus fact here, theory versus reality, where the market rates are interacting very clearly with the policy rates. So it's absolutely true that the central bank is, although they say the lender of last resort, one of the more underlying problems is that the central bank sets and manipulates the rate of interest up or down, above or below the natural level, and that influences the business cycle. So there you go. It's a hopefully not too long primer on the Austrian theory of the business cycle and market interest rates. Thanks for watching.